Centuries of American Indian Wars. In the early years of the American Indian Wars, the United States was hardly the unified, polished landscape we know today. Instead, it was a tapestry of clashing worlds. British colonists eager to carve out their futures, native tribes anchored by ancient traditions, and European empires fighting for control from oceans away. Conflict between the English and native tribes began almost as soon as settlers set foot in North America. By 1609, the Powhatan Confederacy, a network of Algonquin-speaking tribes, found themselves locked in the first of three brutal wars with English settlers in Virginia. Chief Powhatan, who had once cautiously welcomed the settlers, watched the colonists' intentions shift to hunger for more land and resources. The treaty ending the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, signed in 1646 after Powhatan's successor, Opechancanough, was killed, set a grim precedent. From that point on, Virginia's laws set native communities apart, dividing their territory and instilling rules meant to isolate and control them. The Powhatan Wars ushered in a rhythm of bloodshed and uneasy truces, paving the way for generations of similar conflicts across the continent, from the Pequot War in the 1630s, through the Beaver Wars and into the tumultuous conflicts with the Spanish and French. Tribes faced a landscape remade by European guns, strategies, and unyielding hunger for fur and land. In the Beaver Wars between 1640 and 1701, the Iroquois Confederacy fought a bloody battle against Algonquin-speaking tribes, with French allies on one side and English weaponry on the other. Here, Native American ways were essentially transformed. Kinship networks, hunting grounds, and entire cultures were forever altered in these territorial feuds over the beaver pelts that lined European coats and filled their coffers. As the 17th century neared its end, a war of another kind broke out, tinged with religious undertones and territorial desperation. King Philip's War erupted in 1675 when the Wampanoag leader Metacom, known as King Philip to the English, launched a fierce uprising. The war devastated New England's countryside, as colonial towns and native villages alike burned under skies thick with smoke. In the end, Metacom's head was placed on a stake, a warning visible for 2 long decades, underscoring the cost of resistance. Meanwhile, in the sun-baked lands of New Mexico, the Spanish were facing their own clash of cultures and wills. In 1680, Pueblo's spiritual leader, Pope, led a fierce revolt against Spanish settlers who had imposed Catholicism and Spanish rule on his people. The Pueblo revolt was as much a spiritual battle as it was territorial, sparking a 12-year retreat for Spanish forces from the region. This was no small victory. It was a rare and cherished moment where the tide turned, however briefly, in favor of the indigenous people. The early 1700s brought Queen Anne's War, yet another contest between European powers, this time France and England, waging their feud through alliances with native tribes. The period became a prolonged bloody struggle for dominance in trading territories, leaving scars in settlements like Deerfield, Massachusetts, where entire communities were wiped out, and countless native villages faced retaliatory raids. Through the Tuscarora War in the Carolinas and the Yamasee War in South Carolina, both driven by colonists' encroachment into native lands, the pressure of European expansion was pushing native societies to their breaking points. In the Cherokee War, sparked in part by westward expansion, the Cherokee fought against settler encroachment, yet faced forced surrender. And then came Pontiac's Rebellion, a last-ditch stand against colonial advance across the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes. Here, the legacy of betrayal rang through every tree, as native tribes who had once allied with the French against the British found themselves nearly alone after the French pulled away with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it rattled colonial authorities to the core, revealing just how resistant Native nations could be when pushed to the edge. The American Revolution followed closely, complicating everything. The country's struggle for independence from Britain became another platform for violent entanglement of Native and colonial interests. The Mohawk Valley, once a rich stretch of fertile land and cultural prosperity, became a theater of terrifying violence. Loyalist and Native forces, led by Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, raided farms, taking captives, killing settlers, and sending shockwaves of fear through the countryside. General George Washington, who would later be known as the Father of the Nation, ordered a relentless campaign of destruction against the Iroquois. In 1779, Washington ordered the Sullivan Expedition, which marched through Iroquois lands, burning 40 villages to the ground, their crops reduced to ashes, and their people scattered, starving. It was a deliberate effort to break the backbone of Native resistance, an attempt to seal off an entire civilization by eliminating its food and shelter, forcing the Iroquois to retreat in desolation. The closing act of the American Revolution saw one final ominous clash in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Here, Major General Anthony Wayne led an army against Chief Little Turtle and his native forces, who had allied with the British. The conflict ended in a clear-cut American victory and resulted in the Treaty of Greenville, which ceded vast territories that would soon become Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It was a harbinger of things and treaties to come. Land handovers signed under duress, backed by the thunder of cannon fire and the march of boots across sacred grounds. As the 19th century opened its doors, the United States looked toward expansion with fervent ambition. In 1811, at Tippecanoe, the charismatic Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who had dreamed of a unified native force against American settlers, faced his greatest test. After years of preparation, rallying tribes in a single cause, Tecumseh's forces met American troops in a clash that left him and his people with little but ashes of his vision. His efforts to resist would live on as an emblem of defiance, a banner carried by warriors in conflicts to come, from the War of 1812 through the campaigns led by Andrew Jackson. Jackson, later president, would become infamous for his role in these wars. Known for his ruthless tactics, Jackson saw native lands as the rightful future of American settlers. His actions in the First Seminole War echoed his firm belief that native nations held no rightful claim to territories coveted by the United States. During his presidency, Jackson pursued the Indian Removal Act, forcibly relocating tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands to the arid plains of Oklahoma. With every war that Jackson waged or endorsed, from the Black Hawk War to the Seminole Wars, the drumbeat of forced removal grew louder, the message more clear. For Native people, resistance was futile. The story of the American Indian Wars is not merely a string of battles and treaties. It is the account of a people who witnessed the gradual erosion of their homelands, faced betrayals that seared their collective memory, and stood resilient against one of the most relentless forces in history. From the forests of the Northeast to the deserts of the Southwest, Native American communities navigated waves of violence, disease, and broken promises. By the mid-19th century, the Indian Wars had sewn a tragic thread into the fabric of American history. But as it said, all is fair in love and war.